Are red decks winning? Are Pixie decks bouncing back? And what is the most terrifying deck in Standard? All of this and more coming up now. Hello again, everyone. It's me, the RC Recap guy, Optimus Tom, here to bring you what will probably be the last Standard RC Recap in a little while, as RC Montreal just finished up this weekend to the tune of 447 different players, still slinging lots of Standard-based spells. Now, as always in these videos, I will be going over what was played in the room at the RC in Montreal as a whole, and then we'll be drilling it down a little bit more into basically what was the most popular decks being played, and then compare them within those popularity tiers so you get a feel as to what did well and what you might see at your own local events. From there, we're going to take a look at what were the most winning decks in the room, no matter how large the sample size was for those decks. And then after that, we're going to be taking a step back and looking at the top 10 presence decks, and then really drilling down those head-to-head matchups in case you have any sort of standard showdowns, MTGO events, or anything else in your near future, and you're still undecided on what deck you want to play in standard. Now, normally I try to speed run all of this data analysis type stuff, but I do have a bunch of caveats for this one specifically. We are using Melee's tournament platform, and that had 447 registered players with 447 deck lists, but there were a lot of things that needed to be corrected here. Now, nothing too bad like 60 plus land troll list, but there are decks that were misnamed things like colorless being actually an Izzet Prowess list, and a couple of decks named just after the color pairing, like Selesnya or Dimir, with no label whatsoever, which doesn't really help. That meant I had to take a lot of liberties in renaming archetypes and deciding what matched what, so my numbers in general may look different than the other analyses that you see out there for this reason. For example, if an Izzet list ran Zero Swift Spear, Slickshot Show-Off, or Drake-Catcher, it was its own archetype, like an Izzet Midrange Shell. Whereas if it ran Drake-Catcher and Thundertrap Trainer and nothing else with Prowess, then it was Izzet Bounce. Now, I had to do this for most of the popular archetypes, with Esper and Orzhov, Pixie, Demons, Midrange having the most reclassifications. Other than that, we're still looking at Swiss rounds only and not counting buys, but we are counting all draws. Also, one last note here, this RC was like half the size of the US ones, so sample sizes at this event are going to be way smaller, and that means that one match will have a much larger impact on the overall numbers compared to an event of a larger size like the US RCs. After all the spring data cleaning was done, we saw 55 total deck archetypes of the RC in Montreal, with a whopping 32 of them being singleton decks in the room of that type, which made up 58.2% of the RC. That's over half of the room bringing some sort of brew or lesser played deck to the event. That didn't leave a ton of room for decks with just a handful of copies in the room, with only 4 archetypes having 2 pilots at the RC for 7.3% of the total decks, with 3 deck archetypes having 3 copies floating around Montreal for a 5.5% share of the RC floor. 2 deck archetypes had 4 players sleeved up to sling spells from them, accounting for 3.6% of the decks at the event, while decks with either 5, 6, or 7 copies in the room were limited to single archetypes with 1.8% representation each. That left us with 11 different deck archetypes with double-digit copies or higher at the RC, making up the remaining 20% of the room. Now, this is one of the lower metrics for top decks I've seen in a while, but that doesn't mean that the number of players was weighted the same way that the deck archetype distribution was. In fact, the top 3 archetypes made up almost 50% of the RC themselves, and none had more than the top deck for the 4th event in a row, Izzet Prowess. With 123 decks and a 27.5% metagame share, it did fall below a third of the room after the last 2 US-based RCs, but still takes the top spot here. Hot on its heels right behind it, though, as I expected, was a surging class of mono-red aggro players, rallying after the deck's win and performance last weekend in Hartford. 48 red mages accounted for 10.7% of the overall metagame share. Azorius Omniscience tanked in pilots down to just 39, maintaining its spot in the top 3 played decks, however, with an 8.7% of the metagame share. Meanwhile, Jeskai Control was the first of the two Jeskai variants we're used to seeing showing up on our overview, with 30 pilots making up 6.7% of the metagame share, which is actually up half a percentage point from last weekend. Dimir midrange cracks the top 5 after back-to-back impressive performances, with 6.3% of the room sleeving up the deck, or 28 total pilots. Jeskai Oculus falls down to 6th with 24 players keeping track of cards drawn off of their Prowess eidetic memories, with 5.4% of the metagame share, losing almost half of the 9% that it had last weekend in Hartford. Orzhov Pixie is still pulling in pilots, attracted by the good aggro matchups it had the last few weekends, gaining 1.3 percentage points itself up to 4.3% metagame share with 19 total pilots. And the other Orzhov deck from last RC, which was more demonic than Fey, also increased in play rate up to 17 pilots with a 3.8% of the RC competition playing the deck. Cutting out a color also cut some pilots, as the mono black version of the Demons deck lost half a percentage point of metagame representation after a pretty poor showing last week, down to 15 pilots and a 3.4% metagame share of Montreal. And last but certainly not least, we're not forgetting Zur Overlords. The once dominating deck is now the 10th most present deck at these RCs, tying mono black Demons numbers with 15 pilots and a 3.4% metagame share. Other decks of note are just outside the top 10, Azorius Control, which drops the red and took second in Hartford with just one deck too little at 14 pilots and a 3.1% metagame share to crack the top 10. Gruul Delirium, hot off a good showing last weekend, had 5 pilots for 1.1% of the RC metagame, and Esper Pixie, a once top 10 deck, now reduced to just 4 pilots and a 0.9% of the RC competition. Let's continue our discussion about how many decks were in the room by shifting to look at deck popularity and how different decks compared within their tiers. Now, for those that are newer here, popularity is something I've come up with that is used to rank the decks at each event with a letter grade from D tier up through S tier based on where they fall for that event's standard distribution of deck archetypes. Sounds a little mathy because it does use a little bit of math, but what this looks to show is not only how likely you are to encounter these decks on your own Magic the Gathering online or RCQ grind, but also take a bit of a closer look to see if popular also means powerful, or if they fell a little flat. The popularity of Prowess can't be denied, as yet for another event, it skews the distribution towards it as an outlier and is the singleton S tier deck for this popularity metric. Although this event saw the second lowest metagame share for Prowess since RC Bologna where it debuted, the Prowess deck doesn't seem to be letting up on how much it's winning matches. It's gotten to the point where we're seeing sub-archetypes being born out of the same type of deck, pushing and pulling it in different directions. And before the comments get super pessimistic about it, no, I don't think that is a bad thing. What this means is we're going to see spawns of different Izzet decks that are more or less equipped to deal with different metagame decks, which will then lower the overall play rate of the classic quote-unquote stock Prowess decks. Such as here at this RC, we've seen pilots swap back towards playing Slickshot Show-Off in order to combat mono-red decks better, whereas last week I could count the number of Slickshot Prowess decks on my fingers. Now, all of these, in addition to the other decks like Orzhov Pixie popping up, will cut into those Prowess numbers given enough time. Although we don't have many, if any, RCs left, and we get a new set in less than a month's time. Now, I still have to say though, if you're planning on playing a standard showdown at your LGS, or you have an important local standard event you plan on playing, Prowess should be where your deck consideration starts 100%, and more than likely where it ends up as well. Now, A tier is a single deck in and of itself, with mono red Aggro having a legendary comeback weekend as the second most played archetype and the winningest one at that of the top 10 presence decks. Hired Claw and Magebane Lizard had breathed new life into the deck as it shifts away from Monastery Swiftspear as an automatic 4-of inclusion, and Tersa Light Shatter is seeing an uptick in registration these days as well. Now, a better matchup into Prowess is the main reason this deck is returning, while the amount of Omniscience decks and ones similar to it that just require turns of setup to win are a feast for the low to the ground aggressive nature of this red deck. Now, no doubt more popular because it won last weekend, Red is a prime example of how metagame shifts and a few swapped cards can breathe new life into an archetype rather than just counting it down and out. 3 different decks fell into B tier at this event, spanning a smattering of different colors. The Azorius Omniscience deck fell in popularity between Hartford and Montreal, but with less pilots and a different take on the overall meta, the deck bounced back in win rate, having the highest win rate within the B tier and making the combo control backup plan look better than a tempo or straight control plan like the other decks here in B tier. Now, Jeskai control continued to see a lot of play, but without the spell variety needed to handle different decks popping up as aggro got a little less popular, the deck struggled to put up results across the board, falling down to the lowest win rate out of the top 10 decks, but not of the C tier or higher popularity decks. Now, Dimir mid-range, after back-to-back great weekends, finally hit a snag as the deck became a B-tier popularity deck, but ran into issues against some of the higher-tier decks and tanked the win rate down below 50% for the first time in 2 events at a 47.9% win rate overall this weekend. Now, the Omni deck no doubt still has a lot of supporters and still has some legs, seeing as it did better this weekend, so if you're going to be queuing up for Standard anytime soon, I highly suggest not getting rid of your graveyard hate anytime soon, as you don't want this Omni deck to just get a free win over you. Now, C tier has all of the other top 10 presence decks, as well as the 11th most played deck. And, well, Orzhov Pixie, the Prowess killer, has the highest win rate among all of these decks in this tier, giving it increasing amounts of legitimacy as these events grind on, despite never really leaving the lower tiers of popularity week after week. Now, both Demons decks again had sub 50% performances this weekend, and while Mono Black did worse of the 2, it actually increased its own archetype win rate from last weekend, while Orzhov fell a tiny bit in overall win rate. Do with that what you will. The Domain Zero Overlords deck also was below average in performance, but did shoot up 2.8 percentage points in win rate this weekend despite a large drop off in players using the deck, which honestly probably helped the win rate too, because the only people playing this deck were ones that were dedicated and knew a lot of the matchups by heart. Jeskai Oculus was top of the tables just a couple weeks ago, but finds itself both in C tier and below average win rate with a record that only beats out Mono Black, Jeskai Control, and the bottom of the popularity tier's win rate Azorius Control. Now, pieces of Oculus have made their way into other decks such as Tersa and Mono Red, making it seem like the namesake card in the deck might be the thing that's holding it back after all, as the plan to utilize Proseidetic Memory is often how the deck is winning more than the Flying Eyeball. Now, touching on Azorius Control before we move on, although Chris Botello took it to the finals, only 2 pilots took it to day 2, while many more took it home, as the deck had the worst win rate out of all of these ranked popularity decks. Now that we've gone through what was popular in the room, let's weave our way through all the decks and pick out the ones that did the most winning at the RC, regardless of how many copies were actually there. Now, a quick reminder that sample size does matter, and when looking at these decks, I am not advocating for them being the strongest decks of the format, just something for brewers and innovators in the format to keep their eyes on. Additionally, this was a 2-day event with a cutoff of 18 match points in order to make the second day, so decks with 5 wins did not make that cut, unless they also had 3 ties. So be wary of that when we are looking at these lists and their overall records and performance. Now, Simic Terror did well last weekend, so here we have Sultai Terror, iterating on that. The Beanstalk big creature at a discount deck splashed a 3rd color for 2 T cards in the main deck, Nowhere to Run and Rakshasha's Bargain. Now, pilot Arun Marlier used the synergy between Mini Dig Through Time, counting as a 6 converted mana cost spell to trigger up the Beanstalk, over Stock Up, digging 1 card less deep, but ending up with 1 more card in hand at the end of your total exchange. A Tolarian Terror, Eddie Merc Crab, and plenty of Otter tokens are how the deck pushed its damage to end games, with plenty of interaction and bounce spells to pave the way to a 10-4-0 finish. Now, I mentioned how sub-archetypes are getting spawned from the more popular decks, and this quote-unquote Izzet bounce shell is a direct byproduct of that splintering. Now, 2 different versions of this list popped up, with and without Drakecatcher as the lone Prowess creature, with the highest placing one going 10, 3, and 1 in the hands of pilot Max Door, using Drakecatcher alongside Thundertrap Trainer. Quarry Steelcutter and Stormchaser's talent are still here in tandem to overrun with creature tokens, but this package is high on bounce spells for interaction and utilizing cards like Fiery Annihilation as choice removal spell for the mirror matches in the main deck. Now, this deck has similar starts to the stock Prowess decks, but lacks the quick kill angle that the Swiss Spear Slickshot decks have, putting it in a slower category of its own, and one I personally prefer into anything that is not mono-red aggro. Sultai Beanstalk looks mighty similar in creature package to the Sultai Terror deck, but this deck trades in the aggressive spell slinging angle for a much slower control style of deck. Only 2 up the Beanstalk, 0 this town ain't big enough, and 0 Stormchaser's talent means that this deck really crutches on Terror, Crab, and Overlord of the Bailmerk to close out games. Plenty of removal spells like Go for the Throat are backed up by 3 Steps Ahead and Spell Pierce as counter magic, while Locust Spray can kill 1/1 tokens or just cycle for a single block mana to be spent on a second cantrip on the deck alongside Opt. Now, if you're playing tempo control style and you enjoy it, this version of the deck piloted by Samuel Brousseau might be the style of deck for you to try out. What used to be a deck highlighted in the head-to-head matrix part of the video, Esper Pixie has fallen in the eyes of standard players, but bounced back, literally, to a top 10 win rate finish in Montreal. Now, Optimistic Scavenger in the main deck was the iteration from Hartford that saw the best results, and the winningest deck here in Montreal from pilot Mike03 used the human as a 4-of to the tune of a 10, 4, and 0 record. Now, additionally, 2 copies of Preacher the Schism in the main deck really helped to shore up the matches against any decks looking to attack through on the ground, as giving it more than 1 counter from Scavenger made it basically unkillable to singleton burn spells. Sticking to enchantment-based effects to activate the Eerie trigger, the archetype is down to just 2 stock up, a single Kaito, and a Grim Bauble, alongside the For This Town Ain't Big Enoughs as non-creature, non-enchantment cards. Leyline of Resonance has fallen so far out of the metagame that some people might have forgotten that it was a still legal card to play in the format, but 2 Rakdos players utilized the enchantment alongside the aggressive red mouse/prowess package to success in Montreal, or at least success in the hands of Alex McIsaac, who missed the top 8 in the final round with a 10, 4, and 0 record. Cacophony Scamp and Heartfire Hero get lots of damage across to the opponent's face with their death triggers, while the sole quote-unquote black card in the deck, Callous Sellsword, is used for its flinging burn together side to steal games from double-digit life totals. Pilot Hearties took a deck from brew to day 2, as Naya Legends went 8, 6, and 0 at the RC this weekend. Looking to utilize Annie Joins Up to double the triggers of your legendary creatures, cards like Fortune Loyal Steed let you blink anything that is saddling it in order to get more ETB triggers on cards like Roxanne, Starfall Savant, or Beza the Bounding Spring. Plenty of powerful ETB or attack triggers make up the main portion of the deck, including Jeru and Hazaret to keep playing your legendary threats, or Atali Primal Conqueror to play both player stuff. In the hands of Hugo de Lauro, black was the color to add to the Oculus deck over red, as it gave you not only Evangel of Synthesis in the main creature part to synergize with Profs and putting your Oculus in the graveyard, but also gave you access to Bitter Triumph and Pest Control against decks like the Prowess deck. Now, looking more of a mid-range version compared to the Jeskai Oculus version, Hugo did miss day 2, going 5, 4, and 0 at the RC, even with Kaito to pivot to in the sideboard. So yeah, this version of the Oculus deck is definitely more of a grindy mid-range style that sometimes has the reanimation package, but otherwise uses it in a more quote-unquote fair way. Speaking of quote-unquote fair decks, Temur Battlecrier is our first fair Llanowar's deck that we've seen in a long time, as the deck looks to utilize its namesake card right there in the middle in order to reduce the cost of all of its spells to just the colored mana symbols by playing a load of 4-power haymakers as quickly as possible. Now, cards like Lumbering Worldwagon help find those Gruul mana sources while contributing to your 4+ power count the first turn you get to attack with it, while Dragonhawk Fate's Tempest can end a game by itself just hitting the battlefield. Now, Roaming Throne can be used to double that trigger, or ones from cards like Outcast or Trailblazer, which gives the deck a green devotion type feel. Now, Cactus Sure Shot is the grindy way the deck closes out games, and although I say grindy, it's not quite as fair as other grindy decks, because it gives your wide board of 4-power fatties Trample and Haste the turn that you vomit them all onto the battlefield to quickly cause a GG. Well now, here's something the stock Prowess decks haven't been able to do yet. Crack the top 10 win rates for an event overall. Mono Red was the second most played deck at the RC this weekend, which makes it an incredible feat to showcase the win percent of the deck, including mirrors, as the 9th most winning archetype. The shift down in Swiftspear, up in Higher Claw, and swapping in main deck Magebane Lizards for the plethora of Quarry Steel Cutter decks has solidified the red deck back in its top slot of the metagame. The highest placing deck from top 8 competitor Sebastian Lachance, aka MTG Quebec, did not pack Tersa Light Shatter in the 75 the way that some lists did, and forewent having any Urabrask Forge in the sideboard. So that just goes to show, much like the other top decks of the format, the mono red deck still has a couple of different versions of the deck you can use, and all of which are going to get you to a decent win rate. Esper Bounce rounds out the top 10 win rate decks, and while the name and some of the deck construction might make you think it's your standard Pixie affair, there are some key things missing and added to this version of the deck. Now, the biggest difference is the fact that there is only a single copy of Stormchaser's talent in this deck, and instead we see Spyglass Siren, Sheoldred the Apocalypse, and Overlord of the Balemerc as additional threats. The deck is also down on Momentum Breaker, lacks Optimistic Scavenger, and is playing 2 Spell Pierce and a Go for the Throat since the Eerie Synergy triggers aren't there. Additionally, there is only 1 copy of Temporary Lockdown in the 75, despite having all of its 4 This Town Ain't Big Enoughs in the main deck. Now, a Singleton Kaito also hides out in the sideboard, making this 6-5-0 list by pilot Vincent Thibeault look like a mid-range deck with bounce spells just for pure value.
So those were the decks that did the most winning, but let's pivot back to the most present decks and see how they did when put head-to-head against one another. Like winning, but in a different metric. Now, I like to take a look at this specific matchup matrix because it gives us insight into what you should expect to play against if you decide to try one of the top decks, and how it should stack up against your own RCQ, Magic the Gathering online league, metagame, or any other sort of event you're going to go to in just a short amount of time after this video. Again, keep in mind sample size of these matchups, as not every deck played as many games against all the others, especially compared to the Prowess deck. So this is more of a general guideline as to how a matchup may go, rather than a be-all, end-all type of stack ranking.
Now, Izzet Prowess had yet another good weekend with a 51% win rate overall, or 51.6% if you look at the non-mirror win rate. However, I don't want to get anybody's hopes up too much, but this matchup spread is one of the less good ones that we've seen for Izzet Prowess in a little while. I'm not going to say bad, but less good overall. In this head-to-head matchup matrix, we can see that there are 4 decks that have a sub 50% win rate on the Izzet Prowess side. Now, the mono-red aggro matchup did go up some percentage points as we saw Izzet Prowess pilots going back towards Slick Shot Show-Off, because this matchup seems to be more about a race to who is able to deal the most damage first, and the mono-red aggro list now has the edge with Magebane Lizard early on, being something that the Izzet Prowess deck has to bounce and then kill with, or will kind of kill themselves to the damage being dealt to them. Now, the Orzhov Pixie deck continues to be a thorn in the Prowess deck side, as that is only a 40% win rate for the Prowess deck, and the Orzhov Demons deck, it's pretty close to 50% win rate for the Prowess deck. That one may just be due to slight configuration changes between the different Prowess lists, or just maybe the Orzhov Demons deck having the right removal at the right time. Now, the Jeskai control list is actually something that the Izzet Prowess deck is struggling with the more and more it decides to get aggressive. aggressive. 42.6% win rate there is a direct result of some of the lists going back to a more creature-dependent package of damage being dealt. So the different iterations of Izzet Prowess are going to fluctuate with their head-to-head matchups in this way. Now, of course, this still does have a good matchup across a wide swath of the metagame, including the uptick in the Dimir mid-range decks, where it's an above 50% win rate, and actually shining against the Mono Black Demons deck way more than the Orzhov Demons deck, 72.2% win rate in that head-to-head matchup there. So Prowess is still top of the metagame as a deck, even if other archetypes are taking a stab at it. Mono Red Aggro won the last RC and is now the second most played deck at this one, and looking at its head-to-head matchups across the board, it's not hard to see why. The 56.1% win rate against Izzet Prowess guarantees that you have a winning matchup against the most played deck in the room, and the Azorius Omniscience deck still being a top 3 deck at the RC after last weekend's performances means that you have a second good matchup there in your head-to-heads at the top 3 decks at the event. Now, where you start to struggle is against the more controlling shells. We see Jeskai Control having a good matchup against Mono Red Aggro, as well as the Orzhov Pixie deck being a place where the red deck is struggling a bit. The Mono Black Demons deck is having a better time against the Mono Red Aggro than Izzet Prowess lists here, mostly because Mono Red is going to be having a lot of extra creatures, and things like the main deck Magebane Lizard are not very good into that matchup specifically. But some of the decks that need a little bit more time to set up, especially like the Orzhov Demons, the Zero Overlords list, and even the struggling Jeskai Oculus list, are all going to be favorable matchups for Mono Red Aggro. So if you're going to a standard event anytime soon, the Mono Red deck looks to have a very similar matchup spread compared to the Izzet Prowess deck, only if you're thinking Orzhov Demons is going to be there over Mono Black, then you probably wind up taking the Mono Red deck to your local event. The Azorius Omniscience deck actually had a decent weekend, despite us kind of, ragging on it a little bit there with the two aggro matchups, as it had a 51.2 or 51.3% non-mirror matchup win rate across the entire board, which is going up from where it was just a weekend ago in Hartford, where it was kind of struggling and below 50% win rate. Now, as we can see from this matchup spread, the Azorius Omniscience deck does suffer from some of the more popular decks that are going to be seeing play. The Izzet Prowess and the Mono Red matchups, they're a little more aggressive, a little more spell slinging, and we've known that these are difficult matchups for the combo deck to kind of combat. However, the other deck that is rising in popularity that is preying on Azorius Omniscience is the Dimir mid-range deck. This is actually one of the worst matchups for the Omniscience deck, a 36.4% win rate in this head-to-head matchup. So the Dimir deck's tempo interaction style of play is doing even better at hampering Azorius Omniscience than just the direct smash face game plan against it. Now, the one thing that Azorius Omniscience has going for it is those 3 decks are the only ones it struggles against. It has a miraculous win rate against the rest of the top 10 presence decks here at Montreal, including a 100% win rate against the Orzhov Pixie deck, which is going to continue to see play as long as Izzet Prowess and Mono Red are things in the standard metagame. So the Azorius Omniscience deck might not be the best deck in the room, but it is definitely very good against every deck besides the top 2 that are above it. If you saw my post on social media, I said that Jeskai Control was going to be seeing a very similar amount of pilots, where it went up in pilots actually, and was going to be rewarded for not really changing anything because of the way that the aggro decks were going to tick up in play rate. I was a little bit wrong about that one because the Jeskai Control deck continued to struggle. 42.1% win rate overall on the weekend, and if you cut out a couple of those mirror matches in the Control head-to-head, it's 43.1%. So those numbers in and of themselves are not looking great. However, the numbers against Izzet Prowess and Mono Red Aggro, as expected, are pretty good for the deck here. 57.4% win rate in the head-to-head against Prowess is one of the best of these top 10 presence decks, and a 55.2% win rate against Mono Red Aggro means that having a good matchup against the top 2 decks being played would normally put Jeskai Control in a solid place. However, Azorius Omniscience, Dimir Midrange, Orzhov Demons, not even Mono Black Demons here at the RC in Montreal, which was a little bit different when you have a larger sample size at the US-based ones, were all bad matches for the Jeskai control deck. So while control again can prey upon the top decks in the room, the configuration of spells that it packs to beat those decks is not going to be as good against the mid-range and combo-centric things, since it's geared towards beating up on aggro decks. Now, the one side effect this does have is that it continues to have a good head-to-head matchup against the Jeskai Oculus deck, as that deck leans more and more on having a resolved Proceidetic Memory and swinging in with a board full of smaller creatures generating card draw and discard value, which firmly puts it in a similar bucket to the way that Jeskai approaches the aggro matchups. Now, one of my other kind of predictions for this weekend was going to be the uptick in Dimir mid-range pilots and the downtick in its overall win rate. And while I was much more conservative with my estimate, thinking the low end of the range would be 49%, this weekend in Montreal, Dimir mid-range went down to 47.9%, or you get rid of those mirrors, 47.8%. So it did even worse than I was anticipating it doing. However, the deck went up in popularity due to the fact that it was having decent matchups against some of the decks built to combat the aggro decks. Now, one thing that I noticed at the US RCs that was not true here in Montreal was the fact that the Dimir mid-range deck was doing okay into mono red aggro, even having a favorable matchup in that head-to-head. Well, here in Montreal, it flipped the way that we all think it should be going. So with a 40% win rate against Mono Red, the second most played deck, and a sub 50% win rate against Izzet Prowess, the most played deck, although this is the closest to 50% it's been in a long while, the Dimir deck's win rate plummeted. Well, it did still have favorable matchups against the other decks in the metagame, like Azorius Omniscience, Jeskai Control, and some of the Demon Shells, but again, if you're going to be picking a deck that is not good against two of the top three decks in the room, you better either have a spicy good reason in your sideboard that you think can beat those decks, or a very good read on the metagame of those decks not being S tier and the rest of the decks being C tier like the Dimir midrange deck was last week. So if you're packing Dimir midrange, make sure you know what your metagame is going to be, because if it's just all aggro, you're going to be below 50%. Jeskai Oculus has been on a slow but steady downfall in win rate and play rate over the course of the standard RC season. 46.3% win rate is even lower than the Dimir deck, and I was already pretty down when talking about that one. When you look at the head-to-head matchup spread for Jeskai Oculus, it takes until said Dimir mid-range deck to find a favorable matchup for the Flying Eyeball deck. And even then, when you look at the back half of the top 10 presence decks, it's not looking good for Jeskai Oculus. Now, this deck has had pieces of it get tried out in other shells. I'm mainly talking about Terza Light Shatter being used in the mono red aggro deck, so I'm thinking that maybe the Jeskai Oculus list might want to look at what some of the other decks are doing with similar cards and kind of change the way the deck operates. I've already alluded to the fact that Proceidetic Memory is a very powerful part of the Oculus plan, that I see a lot of like stream matches relying on that card more so than the Oculus itself, because there's so much kind of incidental graveyard hate for dealing with the Omniscience deck. So Jeskai Oculus is going to continue to struggle until it kind of evolves its own identity and finds something that is way more powerful or synergistic with the Proceidetic Memory package, or a way to consistently get the Oculus out of the graveyard. Now, what I am thinking is that pilots will get the Oculus out of their deck the way that they have in Modern. So I'm looking to see if there are any more big standard events floating around in the near future if the Oculus deck continues to have that namesake card. All right, Orzhov Pixie. Now, that actually had a pretty good weekend. 51.9% win rate overall, whether you count the mirror matches or not, is a solid above average win rate for a deck that was a little bit below because it just feasted on the aggro decks in the room. Well, with an uptick in mono red and Izzet Prowess still being the best deck in the format or most played deck in the format, Orzhov Pixie was a pretty solid choice for this weekend. Now, it did have a very sad 0% win rate in the head-to-head against Azorius Omniscience. There's only 8 matches played in that head-to-head, so you can't read too far into it, but we do know that the Omniscience combo deck is a little bit of a difficult matchup for Orzhov Pixie, since it's catered towards decks that use creatures and not kind of stopping any sort of combo. But the Orzhov Pixie deck, despite having lower sample size of this event, did have some pretty decent matchups against some of the other decks in the top 10 presence decks. It struggled against the Overlords and Mono Black Demons deck at this event specifically, but with 50% or better win rates against the other decks in the field, you can see how that win rate just starts to shift based on the top-sided, lopsided way that the deck is being constructed to combat the aggro decks. It's very similar to the way that Jeskai Control's head-to-head is going to be lining up with everything. However, Jeskai Control has the head-to-head over the Orzhov Pixie deck, so if you are thinking about doing something along those lines, even though it was a 50% matchup here at this event specifically, it had the matchup in the US RCs before. So if you're thinking about lining up your choice between one of the two kind of control shells, Jeskai Control worse against the rest of the field, but better into Pixie itself. Orzhov Pixie looking pretty good against the rest of the field and a little bit better than Jeskai Control in there. Orzhov Demons was still below 50% win rate this weekend with only 48% or 48.1% to its name, and looking at its head-to-head matchup spread against the field, it was catered towards beating the Izzet Prowess decks, but couldn't really do the same against mono-red aggro. Now, Screaming Nemesis and Sunspine Links, of course, shut off the life gain aspect from the deck, so Unholy Annex suddenly becomes a bit of a liability in those matchups, and the fact that you're going to be playing a bunch of low-to-the-ground creatures in the Orzhov Demons deck and kind of waiting to play some 3-drops means that the red deck can kind of get off to the races early on and may just need to burn you out a little bit. So it's a little bit more difficult than the Prowess head-to-head matchup. However, the Orzhov Demons deck is not great into the Azorius Omniscience deck either, and as long as that deck continues to see a large amount of players piloting the deck, I think the Demon Shell definitely needs something to deal with the Abuela's Awakenings other than just some sort of hand disruption, and kind of needs to deal with the Meringue River Regent game plan, which can then bounce its biggest things, which sometimes are a 6/6 flying demon token, which means it's gone for forever. The Orzhov Demons deck does still have some decent matchups in the other mid-range centric style decks, specifically against Dimir mid-range at this event. 69.2% win rate in 13 matches is looking pretty nice there. So if you're expecting Dimir mid-range as well as a plethora of Prowess decks, the Orzhov version of Demons might be something you lean towards more if you are a bit of a Jundy, grindy mid-range gamer. It's getting harder and harder for me to really advocate for the Mono Black Demons deck, as much of a Mono Black stan as I am. 46.1% win rate is technically better than last weekend, but if you have a technicality on being better, then that kind of just speaks to how the deck is going to be performing. Now, one of the big things is that the Demons decks are supposed to be good against the aggro matches, whereas Orzhov was great into Prowess and meh against Mono Red. Here, that is completely flipped. Mono Black is meh into the Izzet Prowess matchup and good into the Mono Red matchup. So if you expect Mono Red more than Prowess, which you probably shouldn't for the longer period of playing Standard, then Mono Black might be a little bit better to play. But looking at the other matchups, it's even worse in the combo matchup against Azorius Omniscience, and is not holding up the same way that the Orzhov version is in the Dimir mid-range head-to-head matchup. So if you are thinking about sleeving up a Demon Shell, I would still say splash the white. Alright, if you've made it this far into the Standard season and you are still playing the Xur Overlords deck, I don't think any amount of numbers is going to convince you to stop doing that. However, I can encourage you a little bit, because the Xur Overlords deck did see a slight uptick in win rate, although it is still below average overall at a 48.2% non-mirror match win rate. Now, when we look at the head-to-head matchups, it's not all doom and gloom, although the top 3 decks in the room are not looking good for the domain players at all. However, the rest of the decks in the room below that, even though there is a smaller sample size at the RC and Montreal, have been looking pretty good at this event for Xur Overlords. So if you fancy your chance at taking a shot at the decks people are bringing to beat Prowess in Mono Red, things like Jeskai Control, Orzhov Pixie, Dimir Midrange, or any number of the other Demons decks in the room, Xur Overlords doesn't look that bad Ouch. So that's that for the RC in Montreal, and although standard RC season is winding down, I know that the popularity of the format still has a lot of players buzzing, especially with a new Final Fantasy set on the horizon. So what I want to know in the comments down below is, what archetypes do you think are going to persevere through the new set, and what are you excited at iterating upon to try to kind of break the standard format as we're going into a bit of a standard competitive lull for the time being. Like I said, get down in those comments below and let me know what you're excited for. While you're down there, I'd be excited if you could give me a thumbs up on the video so the YouTube algorithm gods know that you like all of this RC recap content that I've been putting out. While you're down there, of course, I would also love if you would become a member to my channel. You can click the join button down below or on the main homepage of my YouTube channel in order to show your support if you monetarily can. Now, if you are a member, you do get certain membership perks such as early access to all of my video content, access to written content and deck guides that I'm thinking of or posting online, as well as Discord access where you can shoot your list over to me over there. And while I should be doing my normal day-to-day work, I'll respond to you with my thoughts and what I think you should do with the deck or how I feel about your list in general. Now, like I said, you could do that by clicking join down below or on the main homepage of my channel to help show your devotion. And as always, you can do the best thing in the world, which is tap that subscribe button to stay up to date on all the latest deck techs, metagame analysis like this, and just in general, all of my Magic the Gathering content. See you later.
For those attending, I've secured both my tickets and place to stay for the next MagicCon in Las Vegas for Pro Tour Final Fantasy. See you there, and let's sling some spells.